Good evening, everybody.
Good evening.
I'm going to try to pay attention, but they tell me President Obama plays his course often, so I'm just going to keep peeking out to see if I get a glimpse. Thank you all for joining us for this event that it has been so important to many of us over the years as we have tried to honor the spirit of Barbara Johns and all that she contributed to not only the Commonwealth of Virginia but to the country. And this is her legacy is not a political legacy. It's not something that I think we should solely take ownership of, but it's something that as Virginians we are proud of. I'm Lamont, Bagby, Chair of the Democratic Party of Virginia, and I am here with the Chair of the Democratic Party of Virginia, Susan Swecker. And we have some special guests with us today, and if they don't mind, I'm just going to refer to them as Miss Joan, Miss Patty, and Miss Susan, because I feel like I'm in somebody's book club right now. And you can call me, I don't like the name Lamont. So whatever comes to mind. Call me anything you want, just don't call me late to dinner. But Susan, I want to thank you for making sure that we had this, even during our transition as chairs. We still had this prerogative role, and I also want to thank our staff for making sure that we were able to keep this on the books and make sure that individuals here are able to hear from our special guests. And also, again, appreciating and taking a pause and recognizing the legacy. And so, without further ado, I will pass it on to Susan Swecker. You all would join me in giving her a round of applause.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And also, I just want to let everybody here know that we are taping this, and it will be available on all of our social media platforms after the fact. And I think, Joan, we can send you or Mr. Robert a copy also if you would like.
Yes.
So, but Chairman Bagby, thank you for everything. And you were right, what you said. I mean, it was a seamless transition. And when I called Chairman Bagby and said, hey, I really want to go ahead and get this event on our annual Barbara Johns event on the books, he's like, yep, let's do it. So thank you for your commitment to continuing this, for folks to have opportunity to learn more about her legacy and what I just do wonder what Barbara Johns would think or say today. I mean, if on that question of, who would you like to have dinner with that's not with us anymore, I would like to sit down and talk to Barbara Johns. And I think probably some of you would too. But this has been a legacy of love for me. And I have learned so much. There hasn't been a year or a time that we haven't done this that I haven't learned something new about Barbara Johns' life and what she meant to the cause. And I do want to thank Joan and Robert and Ernest, the Johns family, for all of your help, your advice, and your friendship over these years. You all have been such valuable, instrumental partners with us. And Patty, I'm going to talk about you later, and thank you for being here. But now I'm going to turn it over to Miss Joan to read a little bit of something that Barbara wrote way back when. I have to have those two.
Hello, everyone.
Hello.
My name is Joan Johns-Cobbs, and I was 12 years old when my sister Barbara Rose Johns led 450 students out on a strike for a better school on April 23rd, 1951. Barbara was only 16 years old at the time. Barbara organized and planned the strike, and she and her fellow classmates met secretly on the athletic field at Robert Rusley Morton High School in Farmville, Virginia. Barbara was a junior at the school, where the conditions were deplorable. Rather than build a new school for the students, the county decided to build 3 buildings that looked like tar paper shacks around the existing high school to accommodate the students. The buildings were cold and drafty and heated with pot-bellied stoves. The students who sat closest to the stoves were too hot, and the other students were too cold. In the winter months, we often sat in class wearing our coats and boots to keep warm. When it rained, we helped our teachers place pails around the room to catch the water. And at times, we had to open our umbrellas. We had to move our desk around so that the water would not drip on our notebooks. I felt that this was not fair to us, that we were not comfortable in our classrooms. We had hand-me-down books from the White High School that were tattered and torn. We had no science labs, no gym, no lockers, no cafeteria, no school supplies. Our teachers had to buy many items that we needed for school. We had excellent teachers who pushed us to excel and demanded our undivided attention. They not only expected us to do well in our classes, but to go on to college to further our education. Barbara decided to go to her favorite teacher, Miss Inez Davenport, who taught both of us music, and discuss the conditions of the school with her. She listened to Barbara and then said to her, "Well, why don't you do something about it?" Her question surprised Barbara, and she felt she had dismissed her with that reply. So Barbara devised a plan that she felt was divinely inspired. She fled to the solitude and peace of the woods deep in the back of our house, where she sat on her favorite stump and contemplated what her course of action would be. There she planned the strike and summoned her fellow classmates that she trusted and coordinated the details of the strike with them. On the morning of April 23rd, 1951, it was a normal school day. But when we were summoned to the auditorium, everything changed. Instead of our principal, M. Boy Jones, on the stage, there stood my sister Barbara at the lectern. I was so shocked and slid down in my seat as low as I could go when she started to talk. She explained to us that the conditions at our school were intolerable and that we needed to go on a strike for a better school. She asked us to cooperate with her and to tell our parents to support us. She made it very clear to us that this was the only way that we would get any results. When one of the students asked if we were going to get in trouble for this, Barbara replied that the Farmville jail was not big enough to hold all of us, so we should not worry. Needless to say, we followed her out of school for 2 weeks. During that time, I was nervous and afraid that our family would be harmed in some way by the white community because of Barbara's actions. I remembered that our grandmother had told us stories about the Ku Klux Klan, so I worried that they would come to our house. The students had devised a scheme to get the principal out of the school prior to the assembly in the auditorium. One of the students, John Watson, placed a handkerchief over his mouth and called the principal's office to tell him that some of the students were downtown when they should have been in school. As soon as the principal left, Barbara sent a note to the teachers to come to the auditorium. She had forged the principal's initials on the note. When they came, she politely asked them to leave. And when one of the male teachers resisted, 2 of the male students led him out of first reaction to what had occurred was fear. Barbara told us not to worry and that we should not be afraid, but I was. I had no idea what the consequences of our actions would be. All that Barbara wanted was to have a better educational facility for us and to be treated as an equal to the students in the white community. After the strike, Barbara realized we were going to need some support. So she contacted Reverend L. Francis Griffin, pastor of the First Baptist Church in Farmville, Virginia. He got involved and helped the students by providing the best advice that he could. He contacted the NAACP in Richmond to get attorneys to represent the students. He also provided the church as a meeting place so that the community could seek and get information on what had happened, what their options were, and how to best handle the situation. My sister Barbara died in September of 1991, and after she died, her husband found her diary. And in her diary, she spoke about what happened the day of the strike. So I am going to read what she wrote. And I quote, "We were fond of our teachers. My favorite and the one who had the greatest impact upon my young life was Miss Davenport, my music teacher, who later became Mrs. Jones, wife of the principal of the school. Besides introducing us to the beauty of classical music, she permitted full expression in her class, something quite foreign to most of the classes. Most teachers taught and you listened and responded to their comments when requested. But Miss Davenport felt that everything in life lent itself to a variety of options, thoughts, moods, moments, much the same as music, and she encouraged you to respond that way. I got to know her more intimately when she became the music teacher for my sister and I when we took piano lessons after school. I felt I could share my innermost thoughts with her and she wouldn't consider them ridiculous. This is how I happened to mention to her how unhappy I was with the school and its inadequacies. I told her that it wasn't fair that we had such a poor facility and equipment when our white counterparts enjoyed science labs, a huge facility, a gym. I warmed to my subject and looked to her for some answer to my frustration. And that's when she paused and said, "Well, why don't you do something about it?" I was surprised, but it didn't occur for me to ask her what she meant. I just slowly turned away. What could one do about such a situation? I had no idea. But I spent many days in my favorite hangout in the woods. And I sat by the creek while Sadie Red, our horse, drank. And I thought about it. My imagination would run rampant. And I would dream that some mighty man of great wealth, through God, would build us a new school building. Or that our parents got together and surprised us with this brand new building. And we had a big celebration. I even imagined that a great storm came through and blew down the shacks and scattered them to splinters. And out of this wreckage rose this magnificent building. And all the students were joyous, and even the teachers cried. But then reality would set in, and I would be forced to acknowledge that nothing magical was going to produce a new school. And then there were times I just prayed, "God, please grant us a new school. Please let us have a warm place to stay where we won't have to keep our coats on all day to stay warm. God, please help us. We are your children too. This type of thinking went on for months. Sometimes as I chopped the wood, sometimes as I fed the pigs. When I did work or as I sat quietly, it would crop up in my mind because I felt we were not treated like any other students. That classes were not held in the auditorium, they were not cold. They didn't have to leave one building and transfer to another. The buses weren't overcrowded. That teacher, bus driver, did not have to make fire before he could start classes. One morning, I was so busy rushing my brothers and sisters down the hill to school that I forgot my own lunch and had to rush back up the hill to retrieve it. In the meantime, the bus arrived, picked them up and left me standing there by the roadside, waiting to thumb a ride with whoever came by. About an hour later, I was still waiting when a white school bus came by, half empty, on its way to Farmville High School. It would have had to pass my school to get to their school, but I couldn't ride with them. Right then and there, I decided that indeed something had to be done about this inequality, but I still didn't know what. All day my mind and thoughts were whirling, and as I lay in my bed that night, I prayed for help. That night, whether in a dream or whether I was awake, I felt I was awake. A plan began to formulate in my mind, a plan that I felt was divinely inspired, because I hadn't been able to think of anything until then. That plan was to assemble together the student council members who I considered the creme de la creme of the school. However, they were smart and were thinkers. I knew them and trusted them, and I was a part of them. From this, we would formulate a plan to go on a strike. We would make signs, and I would give a speech stating our dissatisfaction, and we would march out of the school. People would hear us, would see us, and understand our difficulty, and would sympathize with our plight, and would grant us our new school. Our teachers would be proud, and the students would learn more. It would be grand, and we would live happily ever after. Fully confident that all of this would have transpired, I arose early the next morning, rushed to get everyone out, and I could hardly wait to get to school to call this meeting. I was self-sufficient and independent because my mother was not around to rely on or to consult. My father was too busy plowing and planting and harvesting to have time for any fantasy of mine, and he would have considered it foolish. He would have never agreed with it, but he would not have stopped me. End quote. With that, everyone, my sister led all of us out of school, and the rest is history.
Thank you so much. I had heard you read this once before, and this is inspiring every time I hear it. And I don't know in this day and age if Barbara could pull it off with all the social media and the way things look out, but it's still just incredible that a 16-year-old organized all of that and has ended up making such a difference. So this moves quite perfectly into introducing our guest and author, Patty O'Connell Pearson, and she is nearby, right down the road here in Fairfax City, an accomplished author and I believe you're a former history teacher.
Yes.
Back before you started publishing, and she just told me that this book, We Are Our Children Too, which she'll be in the back and you can buy them and get them autographed at the end. And I can tell you, I read it a couple years ago when it came out, and it's great. But she just received the International Literary Association Social Justice Literature Award for this very and I just, as a little bit of history on this event too, and I'm just so honored that you're here, because I think it just kind of completes these years of great speakers that we've had. We've had everybody from a former Attorney General Eric Holder to Khizr Khan to State Senator Henry Marsh, who recently passed away and was part of the Hill Tucker Marsh law firm that represented Barbara Johns and the families in the lawsuit, Brownfield Board of Education, and other like folks that just like James G. and Carl Eggleston, who many of you know, who were unable to finish their schooling at Moden. And James, I know his family sent him to Iowa to live with the Quakers, and I think Carl's went somewhere nearby. But we've been really, really fortunate. We've had scholars and other authors, but I'm just delighted today, Patty, that you could be here with us. And I'm just going to kick it off and ask you, what first drew you to the story of Barbara Johns in Prince Edward County? And was there a particular moment or person that, as you're starting to do research, that I'm going to dig a little deeper, this is really fascinating or interesting to me?
So it was in very early 2020. If you recall, we were all hiding in 2020, and I was looking for a new topic. I'd written 3 books at that point, and they're all, I didn't plan it, but whenever I find a topic I like, it tends to be a smaller story inside a bigger story. It tends to be about ordinary people who do something extraordinary. And in this case, of course, very young people who did something extraordinary. And it tends to be connected to civics and government in some way. And this one isn't vaguely connected to civics and government. It really hammers on it. And so I happened to come across an article in the paper about a book that was about Prince Edward County. And when I saw the blurb, it sounded vaguely familiar to me. Now, keep in mind, I had taught American history in Virginia, here in Fairfax County, for 25 years. And this story was only vaguely familiar to me. And so I got that book and read, and as I read, I realized that this was right up my alley in terms of the kinds of stories I like to get into. But more than that, it touched on the upset and anxiety I was feeling at the time. Obviously, part of that anxiety was the pandemic, but another big piece of that anxiety was the open, overt, ugly, constant racism and racial violence that was in the news every day. And it had just escalated in that time period. And so I thought people should know this story. And while I mentioned it to my agent, I decided I'd just look and see, is there information out there? Is it something I can do? I write for ages 10, 11, 12, and up. So, some stories you can get at that level, and some are maybe too ethereal. And so as I'm looking at that, that's when George Floyd was murdered. I'd already started into this. And that just, suddenly the Black Lives Matter movement is everywhere. It had been around for quite a while, but it's now everywhere and it's international. And so I thought, no, I do want to write this. But at the same time, I was hesitant to write this because I thought, maybe I'm not the right person to write this. This isn't my story. I didn't grow up in Prince Edward County. I didn't grow up in Virginia. I didn't grow up in the South. So this whole scenario is foreign territory to me. But aside from that, there are still plenty of people around as I'm doing this who participated, who were there, who were victims, who were activists who were all those things in this story. And do I, as a white person not from the South, am I the right person to write this story? So I got hold of, I couldn't go there, of course, it was the pandemic, so I couldn't go meet anybody, I couldn't go look at Farmville and Prince Edward County and see, you know, get a sense of the place and that sort of thing. I couldn't do any of that at that time. But I did contact the museum, the Moton Museum, and if you've never been there, you must go. It's amazing what they can do in a very small space and with a topic that doesn't have artifacts. You know, it's not, oh, here's the pot used for whatever. And so I did, and I talked to Kanan Townsend, who's now the director down there. And first that we'd emailed, of course, you know, and that I was thinking about doing this book and whatever. And so, and I was still in my mode of, I'm not the right person to do this. Well, he was polite too, so he didn't say, I don't think she's the right person to do this. But he had thought it. And so he said, I said, can we talk? And he said, absolutely, we can, you know, fill you in on stuff that you can't get easily and whatever. And we decided to do a Zoom call, which we all got sick of real fast during the pandemic, but we did a Zoom call, and I thought, this is a great way to do this because I don't have to say I'm not the right person. If you can see me across the airwaves, you will know. And so that's what we did. And he went to the other people at the museum, and it was so wonderful that we did a book talk together when the book came out, and he said, after that first conversation, he was fine. And so he went to the other people at the museum and said, I think this will be fine. And so I've been down there since, of course, except more than once, and gotten to know him. He stayed at our house when he came up for the book talk and all that sort of thing. I considered him a young friend. He's a very young guy. Anyhow, so that's how I got into it. And the moment of saying this is the right story had nothing to do with Barbara directly. It had to do with the sudden atmosphere in this country, that it was the right time to be telling this story. Any time would be the right time to tell this story and a million others, but that kind of really clinched it for me.
One of the, well, again, learning something new that I learned out of your book was more about President Kennedy's commitment and relationship with Prince Edward County and Moton, as well as his brother Robert Kennedy as head of justice. And I wondered if you, and we had actually Kathleen Kennedy Townsend, remember, a couple years ago, and I was able to share your book with her, and I think she even learned some things about her parents that she was not aware, because she said, and you know, they talked about it at the dinner table, but there were some minute details that you had in the book. So can you talk a little bit, you know, just about that piece of it, and because I thought it was, you know, it was fascinating how President Kennedy, you know, tapped RFK to, you know, go raise money through the foundation or private entities to get these kids in school.
Yeah, so there had been great hope. When Kennedy was elected in 1960, there was great hope in the Black community across the country. He hadn't done much about civil rights. When he'd been in Congress, he didn't do anything about civil rights. That was not his issue. And yet, he had said in campaigning that he supported Brown versus Supportive Education. Now, that doesn't sound like a huge deal, but it was. And so, it was more than anybody else had done. And so there was great anticipation, and then not much happened after he became president. You know, presidents get torn in a million directions, of course. And so he had appointed his brother, and there was huge controversy over that, to be the Attorney General. And he was very young, and he was more focused on civil rights and social justice issues than John Kennedy was, just by instinct, by his own personality. And so when this story came along, because the strike was in 51, Brown versus the board was decided in 54, and Prince Edward County closed its schools in 59 after they delayed as long as they could. The Supreme Court came back and said, open the schools. And they said, oh, we don't have schools. And they closed all the public schools, black and white, and then opened a segregation academy and found a way to use taxpayer money for vouchers for the tuition for that school, but there was no school budget coming from the county. And so Robert Kennedy learned quickly that the federal government does not open schools. There was nothing they could do. That's a state function. And the state of Virginia was doing nothing about it. And so what they could do was offer assistance in developing a school, in organizing stuff, but they couldn't actually send federal money down there and open a school. And so Robert Kennedy he had a staff assistant who he put on this, who spent untold hours driving back and forth, from DC to Richmond to Farmville to Richmond to DC, and he spent the next 8 months or so getting ready to open this school in early 63, in September of 63. And so he spends the whole spring doing that, and it had to be done with private money. It could not be done with government money. And so John Kennedy then writes a check for $10,000. I don't know what that would be today. It would be a lot more than $10,000 as his personal donation to this foundation, and then kind of nudged his wealthy friends. And it's sort of hard to say to the president, I'm not going to give it to the cause you want me to give it to. And so they were able to get together about $1 million, and that was enough to do the schools, what they called the free schools, for 1 year. And so Van de Heuvel, I'm never sure if I'm saying his name right, but he hired a superintendent from Long Island. And this was a guy who was white. He had been principal and superintendent in a very white region out on Long Island, in a very white county. And so people were a little taken aback. That's why I hired him. But this was a man who believed in ungraded education, non-graded. Not that you don't get grades, but you're not in a particular grade. You go where your skill set is, and you progress at your own speed. These are kids who've been out of school for 4 years. So they were all over the place in terms of their skills. Some of them had never learned how to read. Some of them had somehow managed to find a way, maybe their parents were well educated and able to keep them up and that sort of thing. So he knew it was gonna have to be a different sort of school. And this guy set that up then over the course of the summer and was able to get it open on time. And as it happened, opening day was the day after the Birmingham bombing of the church in Birmingham where the 4 little girls were killed. So the atmosphere that day, the fear on the part of the teachers, the parents, everybody concerned was just huge. But they opened and did not have any trouble. I mean, there were plenty of people in town who weren't happy, but it was not that kind of thing. And so the free schools were there for a year. And his big goal was that he had to have white students there, or they couldn't say that these schools were for everybody. But the whites all had their kids or most of them had their kids in the private academy and weren't going to switch. But he managed to get a couple of families. And what I wonder about that is what makes, for example, one of them was the son of a professor at Longwood University who had taken up he was a segregationist himself. He'd grown up in that region, not in Prince Edward, but in that part of Virginia. And it was this that opened his eyes. And he defended education for everybody. He'd always wanted education for everybody, but now he was all in on desegregating. And it destroyed his career. But his son then said, I want to go to that school. to the free school. He'd been at a private school outside the county during this time. And he was gonna be a senior, which is really a hard time to change schools anyway. And somebody asked him, why would you wanna do this? And he said, I've been watching my father for the last 4 years. It's the least I can do is go to this school. And then there was another family who recently moved to the county, tobacco farmers. Very little money, but they're gonna enroll their daughter in this school, and the woman said, well, we believe education should be free. We're not sending her to that academy. And the superintendent said she might be the only white student in the school. And this woman said, well, I'm all right with that. That's okay. Fair is fair. And so, why can some people be that? You know? Which say, how hard is it to be that instead of the other people? But anyway, so that was, and of course when Kennedy was assassinated, then right after the free schools opened, Kennedy was assassinated. And Robert Kennedy came later that school year. He was going to speak at Longwood and, or in Farmville, and the kids raised money, and I think they came up with, I forget what it was. I mean, the kids were, you know, donating pennies and dimes and stuff for this foundation he was running to do with his brother, and so they had a real moment there.
Were there any surprises or moments during the research of this book that changed the direction of the book or your understanding of the story as you went, you thought it was going into it?
I didn't come across a whole lot that was surprising necessarily. I mean, certainly there was just stuff I didn't know. I hadn't been in that area. I'd never been to, well, I think I had been to Farmville once when our oldest one was looking at colleges, but it was a quick on your way to the next school visit. So I didn't know the area. So it wasn't necessarily surprising, but it was enlightening. And one thing that I hadn't thought about, that I guess when I came across the information, I was a bit surprised, was how good Moton High School was. What the quality of that faculty was. And once I read that and thought about it, I realized it made sense, because you have these very well-educated people who cannot get jobs elsewhere in the normal way somebody with a master's degree or whatever would get jobs because they're black, and so they're not stepping down to teach, but you have a larger pool of really well-qualified people. And they were demanding, and what impressed me was their mission, and the principal too, Mr. Jones, their mission to teach these young people how to succeed, how to make the most of themselves in a society that didn't want them to do that. And that to me was just, to give them the tools to really go out there and be successful within the parameter of all this segregation and stuff. It was very impressive. So I think that, as I say, not quite surprising, but impressive.
I have some other questions I can ask, but I wanted to see if any of you all had any questions, because I want to make sure you get those in also. Does anybody have anything?
Hey, Susan?
Yeah, Ken Plum.
Do we know the timeline on when the statue's gonna go in the U.S. Capitol of Barbara Johns?
I just asked, let's see, Ernest, I just asked you, and he said talk to Robert, I think. So I don't know whether Robert or Joan wanna
talk about that. I think he knows more about it what's going on.
Uh-oh, Robert, you're up.
Well, I don't really know exactly when, but I will say this, that I don't think the current political climate is, that it's the time. And this is a personal opinion. I feel very strongly that there would be pushback at this time based on what's been occurring with DEI and the museums and things of that nature. But it is almost complete. and it's really a beautiful statue. Yeah, so I think all of you will be pleased with what has transpired, and I think in a couple of weeks it probably will be completed.
So we'll wait further announcement then, I guess, right?
Yes, at this time,
Okay.
yes.
Any additional?
Thank you for the presentation. It was really, really enlightening. As a person who did not grow up in Virginia, I find this really fascinating. So 2 questions actually. One, I'd like to learn a little bit more about that timeline between the walkout and when the schools were, I guess, opened up. What was taking place during that time? Did these children just not receive any education whatsoever? Or did the community come up with alternatives? So that's sort of question number 1. And then number 2.
Let's do one at a time.
Oh, sure, go ahead.
We'll do one. Let's do one.
From the time of the school strike to, let's see, that was 1951, and the Supreme Court made a decision in 1954 to integrate the schools. And rather than to integrate the schools, Prince Edward County decided to close the schools from 1959 to 1964. And there were lots of students who did not get an education, but there were also, I understand there were some white students that did not get an education also because they couldn't afford to pay for the school. That's my understanding. I know that 3 of my brothers-in-law were involved in the school closing, and what happened is the Quakers came to help the students who were out of school, and they were able to place some of the students with families in order for them to finish their education. So 2 of my brothers-in-law were placed with white families, and 1 was placed with a black family. But it's, the story is fascinating in that there were white families that were willing to take in these students to help them finish their schooling. And, but there were several that the majority did not have, well, I can't say the majority, but a lot of them weren't able to finish their education. And so there is a scholarship program now that was put into place, I think maybe 5 or 6 years ago, by a former editor of the Farmville Herald. His name was Ken Woodley, and he went to the legislature in Richmond and got money to offer scholarships to those students who were left out of school. However, not many of them were able to take advantage of it because at that time, after all that time, they were no longer at the age, they were beyond the age of going. Some of them went to school at that age and they were feeling very bad in a classroom with such young students. Also, he was able to ask the legislature to help the families of the students who were left out of school, their children. So right now they are still providing money for those students for the families of the students who were left out of school. they started with the children, and now they're trying to help the grandchildren of those students. So that's what has transpired since the walkout of 1951.
What's your second question?
Oh, probably not.
Okay, back to you, Russell.
Thank you. This question is more so for Ms. Pearson. Your book sounds great. Is enough being done to tell the story of Barbara Johns to the current generation of Virginia students? Or are you speaking at in schools and libraries, etc., to tell that story so they understand what took place in those years and, frankly speaking, how to avoid anything like that from occurring in the future?
I don't really have much of a way of knowing how many places the book is being used. The way the publisher counts books, I can't figure it out. So, but I do know that, for example, at the Motor Museum, they do a Bridges program, they call it, with the local high school, and they use the book as a text in that course. And I have spoken last year, and I'm about to do it again in a couple weeks, at Langston Hughes Middle School in Reston, which is part of the Fairfax County Public Schools, and they bought classroom sets of the book to use in their civil rights unit that they do at the tail end of the year, every year. And so I went and talked with them, all the 7th graders, 400 7th graders, and I'll do it again this year. And I have run into people who will say, oh, my son, my grandson, my granddaughter, whatever, they were using this book in her class. But I don't know very directly how that happens. It's in the public libraries, and it's in a lot of school libraries, at least the last time I looked. So it is being used. How enough? I don't know.
Yeah. So one of the things I even listened to you all and just thinking about and reflecting back to the 50s, the 60s, the 40s, and some of the same struggles we're dealing with still today, particularly in our rural communities and in our impoverished urban communities. And so I do have a question about that in a moment. But I also will go back to what you mentioned just a moment ago as relates to the moment that we're in. It's almost as if we're putting things on pause, and when we were progressing a bit, but we're putting things on pause. And one of the things that you all may not know, that I had a piece of legislation in the Senate this year that would make African American history an option in our high schools for not just a elective course, but it would be a substitute for one of the history courses related to SOL graduation. And so students could take African American history in our schools. Books are great, but the book that we really want is the textbook. In African American history, particularly Virginia history, particularly Barbara Johns, and all this other rich history that we have in Virginia should be taught in the schools, and not just to African American students, to all of our students. We learn everybody else's history, they should learn a bit about it. And so, as we reflect and we think about this book is great to have on our library shelves, but we need a textbook in their book bags that reflects our history. And every student should not go away knowing the history of folks across the ocean more so than those individuals that they're looking at every single day in their respective communities. And so one of the things that this question was given to me, but it means even more to me now, and that is, we are your children too. That title, and thinking about some individuals back then were willing to sacrifice their children's education in order to block your education.
Mhm.
We're dealing with that same thing today. Folks are actually voting against their interests just so they can hurt other people. And so, Ms. Pearson, could you touch on a little bit of how you came up with "We Are Your Children Too"?
Can I ask you just a question though? What happened to your bill?
I didn't write the book. Oh, no. So as of Friday, the governor vetoed it.
So we're gonna get that fixed next year when we have a governor in office, right?
You heard that from the chair?
So the title, I read that diary that Joan was talking about, and it's a big chunk of those first few chapters of the book. And when I read that, which you heard her read, that Barbara was praying and so forth and so on, and "We are your children too," and it hit me in the face that that's what Barbara was thinking. She's talking to God, which she was, but I'm thinking, and to the white power structure in Prince Edward County, "We are your children too." And so I thought that double meaning was why I suggested it. I don't get to pick the titles really, but I suggested that and they went with it. And I was very pleased. But if I could piggyback on the business about the textbooks, one of the things I like to mention when we talk about this stuff, even though it's not directly connected, is one of the things we've got to teach in our history classes, whether we get down to the specifics of the Barbara Johns story, which obviously is a very specific story, but a much bigger story that we don't teach in our survey courses, and those are in 4th, 7th, and 11th grades. We teach U.S. history in Virginia. And what doesn't get taught is the lost cause. And if we don't understand how we got into this mess, there's no getting out of the mess, because you go to change street names or school names or whatever it may be, as happened quite a bit 5 years ago, and people will say, "You're changing history." Well, no, we're changing the lies about the history. Oh, or that's revisionist history. Yeah, because it needed revising. It was inaccurate. And so in that period after the Civil War, the saying, the victor gets to write the history, did not happen after the American Civil War. The losers wrote the history and portrayed themselves as this noble cause, which is never defined. Look anywhere, you can't find a definition for it. And that these were the noble soldiers, much more noble than those northern soldiers. And the only reason the north won was they had just so much more money and arms and what have you. And that's how you get into Texas saying slavery wasn't the cause of the Civil War. But if you read there the Texas Declaration of Secession, it's 1 page long and it mentions slavery 13 times. Doesn't mention any of that other stuff. And so it was that very intentional misinformation, disinformation, we would call it today, propaganda, and the United Daughters of the Confederacy raising bazillions of dollars to put statues everywhere. Every tiny town, including Farmville, a statue of a Confederate soldier, nobody in particular, a Confederate soldier looking south with a weapon in front of the courthouse of the town square. And every black person has to go for business into those areas, has to walk by that thing every day. And the school kids get their pictures taken in front of it for this class picture. And that's how the people in Farmville were who they were. The white people in Farmville. They were raised that way from the cradle. So it took somebody really extraordinary to break out of that. Particularly if you never lived anywhere else, if you never moved around and so on. That was your world. And so that to me is what absolutely has got to get in the curriculum. is the lost cause. We teach Civil War, Reconstruction, and now we're going west and having industry, and we miss that chunk. So that's my 2 cents on it.
So, I have a desire to take one more question. Anybody have an additional question? Please hold. Yes, there's one in the back.
I'm sorry, I came very late, but I'm very grateful to see all of you. My question to you is listening to you, talk about the history, curriculum, etc., etc. I went to British military schools, but I come from a generation where the British weren't talking about imperialism and colonialism and all of that anymore. They were actually talking about all the mistakes they'd made in history and towards the people that they'd often suppressed. I grew up believing in that truth, and then I went to university in Germany where they taught you all of their own sins and crimes. And I'm horrified to come to a country like America. I am now an American, military, etc. And I'm horrified that such a chunk of history is not just taught wrong, but as the lady said, there was propaganda over decades and possibly a couple of centuries, and it's being frowned upon to bring out the truth. How do you change the mentality of the average American to teach them that this whole inclusive history is the truth and that everything else has been propaganda and disinformation?
I think never gonna reflect back, and that concludes our nonpartisan part of the program.
What? I would say the truth is never partisan.
That is true.
Did you miss last November? The reality of it is, and this is the fact that we have seen not only the attack on our African American history, we've seen an attack on the funding of our schools, we've seen an attack on our HBCUs, and not only that, you talked about taking pictures with the monuments, with students taking pictures of the monuments. One of the things we were able to do when we had the majority back in 21 and 22 is really put some pressure on VMI to get rid of their Confederate monuments. They got rid of it, but if you recall, those students had to salute those monuments every time they passed them, going to the cafeteria, going to their barracks. Well, they had to salute that. And you think about that. So attack on our K-12 education system, attack on our African American history, and attack on our HBCUs, and then take it a step further. And now they're aggressively attacking the predominantly white institutions when they have African American presidents. And so it's the fight is not even as if the book is ready to be finally written. They're still putting ink on the paper as it relates to the disenfranchisement. And so these elections matter, and this coming election is going to matter because not only are we going to be able to protect the African American history and make sure that we're actually teaching that, we're actually going to be able to do something about what's going on in our PWIs, protect our HBCUs. One of the things we also did this year, and I'm proud of, is I had a budget amendment to take a church, African American church, First African Baptist Church, which was situated on Broad Street, and is the church that many African Americans went to, going all the way back to Reconstruction. Those individuals that served in the General Assembly, those black individuals that served in the General Assembly during Reconstruction, actually went to that church. When they needed a meeting space, they didn't have a meeting space in that square, so they met at that church. Doug Wilder will also oftentimes tell you about his experiences in church because that was his childhood church. And so that church ended up being sold to Virginia Commonwealth University. Not the best space for that church. So what we were able to do this year is to take the ownership of that church and give it to Virginia State University. And Virginia State University now owns that property with the opportunity for Virginia Union University, which is a private institution, to now operate that. And then we're gonna have some space there for a museum, and it's gonna honor L. Douglas Wilder. And so there's opportunities once we win these elections to do some things about these wrongs. But you have to win these seats before you can do it. And it's not all about taking something from somebody and giving it to somebody else. But I mean, when you think about what you meant, what you shared, Ms. Joan, about the families and the children and the grandchildren now reaping scholarships and so forth. You think about those years and years of individuals that are reaping the reward of other families being disenfranchised, whether it's slavery or just being able to own a piece of property and inheriting that piece of property and not being redlined. And you're passing it on from generation to generation to generation. But what about that black family that didn't have anything to pass on from generation to generation to generation? And so those are the things that are tough to have a conversation about. Real tough now with what's going on with Donald Trump, and I won't just say Donald Trump because we're having it right here with Glenn Young and Winsome Earl Sears. And so I'm excited about this November because it's another step of correcting some of these wrongs. And with that, I'm going to pass it on to Susan Swecker to wrap it
I'm
up.
gonna let you wrap it up. But I will say one thing, for your question, lady in the back. Don't ever forget about the power of one person to make a difference. So when you think about what 16-year-old Barbara Johns did that day to organize that walkout, and it wasn't just that walkout. She somehow managed to persuade the premier civil rights lawyers that were putting together this Brown v. Board case, Oliver Hill, Henry Marsh, and you know that she found Spotswood Robinson, and I can't remember whether it was Spotswood or Oliver Hill that she got a hold of.
Oliver.
Was Oliver?
Yeah, he told me.
Okay, you want to tell? I mean, can you tell that? Because this is an incredible moment that she was able to do this.
Honorable Oliver Hill told me that Barbara was persistent, so she called him personally to ask that they come to help the students out.
So they were on their way to somewhere down around Roanoke or Western Virginia to meet with another group. And basically it was like, well, it's on the way, let's just go hear her out. So again, the power of one. But for that one person organizing when her teacher said, you know, what are you gonna do about it? So I think our challenge is, what are we, you know, individually and together gonna do about it? And that's what I would like to leave us here with, like, remembering Barbara Johns and her bravery. Bravery in those times, because your folks sent you away, didn't? I mean, they sent her away after
she
that.
had to go to Montgomery, Alabama,
To finish
to finish school.
It was,
So
yeah,
Virginia
but
was
safe to be
worse
there.
than Alabama then.
And that says something, right? That says
To go to
something.
Montgomery, Alabama, and you know, to finish schooling, because some of my neighbors, well, our neighbors, my understanding from my father, we were all farmers, and we had our farm, and white folks had their farms. We all lived in the same neighborhood up the road from each other. They had all the equipment. They had the combines and the tractors, and we were still pushing mules and horses. So we would get together and we would help them get their crops in, and they would help us get our crops in. So my father had a relationship with some of the whites in the area, and it was a good relationship, as well as could be, you know. He got word from one of the white farmers that after she led the walkout, that maybe he should get his daughter out of that area. So it was some things going on, and they brought it to my father's attention, and that's how my uncle Vernon Johns was in Montgomery at that time at Dexter Avenue Baptist Church, the church that Dr. King went to after him. But he was down there, and so she had to go down there to finish her high school. So there were some issues in the area that we didn't really know about until later, when we found out some of the things that were happening, because we had heard about some of the things going on, but we hadn't personally experienced nobody riding by our house and making threats or nothing like that. My father did spend a lot of time, we had a cornfield in front of our house, and to this day we don't know why he spent a lot of time in that cornfield with his shotgun. So, I mean, he would take his shotgun and he would go down there some nights and spend time down there. We never knew why. That may have been a cause, but that's what I had. And one other thing, the effect in Farm Bill with them closing the schools for the blacks and some of the whites, but the blacks that didn't get educated, some of their kids didn't get educated because they couldn't teach their kids what they knew because they didn't know anything. And there are still families down there in that area who are uneducated because of something happened way back there, and it's a tragic situation. And one of the things, and I appreciate them getting money to help with education, but when you're 60 or 70 years old, you can't get no education. You need to give them money to do something with. You know, that would have been, I would have argued for, put that money that you're giving them for education into helping them buy a house. You know, or educate, pay that college tuition for their grandkids. Because they got grandkids now who don't really have fully education. So that's my take.
Thank you. Absolutely.
May I just say, I think the reason my father was in the cornfield with the shotgun was because there were threats on Barbara's life. And like my brother said, one of his fellow farmers, white farmers, told him so that he was able to get her out of the area in order to finish her high school. So that was a traumatic time for us, as you can imagine. We didn't know why they were sending Barbara away and all of that, so it was a lot, you know, it was a lot to absorb at a time like that. And also, it affected our finances, even though we were farmers. In town, the power structure there would allow black people to put their clothes or whatever on layaway and pay when they can or whenever they could. But after the strike, they took that away as well. So my mother had to end up leaving the area to go to Washington to work from Monday to Friday in order to help make ends meet. And that is why when you heard Barbara's story about my mother wasn't around, that was because she was working in Washington during the week and coming home on the weekend. And that put Barbara in a role of being the mother figure in our household. So when she said she had to rush her brothers and sister down the hill, it was because she had the role of a mother. So she had a lot on her young shoulders at that time. And really, it was amazing that she was able to do that in that period of time, because back in the 50s, things were, terrible as far as race relations were concerned. And even though the KKK didn't burn across at our house, they burned across at the school, at our school. So it was, as I said, I was afraid of that. When she did that, I was afraid of what might happen to us because of that.
Yes,